The African Union plans to launch a new African credit ratings agency next year to address the group's concerns that ratings given to countries on the continent are unfair. This is according to Misheck Mutize, lead expert for country support on rating agencies with the African Union. Mutize said the agency, which would craft its own assessment of the risks in lending to African countries, would be based on the continent and would add context to the information investors consider when deciding whether to buy African bonds or lend privately to countries. They allege that the big three ratings agencies are quicker to downgrade them during global crisis, an allegation the three ratings agencies have denied. From Cape Town in South Africa, I have an economist, Professor Roux. He is joining me to talk more about this particular development. Thank you so much, Professor, for talking to us on the show.
Thank you so much for the invitation, and good day to all your viewers.
So does Africa need its own rating agencies, despite the fact that some are already doing this same work on the continent? We look at firms like Augusto and Company and GCR. Do we still need an AU-created or backed rating agency?
I think on balance, the idea makes sense. As you quite rightly pointed out, we have the big three, the well-known Standard & Poor's, Moody and Fitch. They've been around for, in some cases, centuries. And I think we need to establish what their purpose is. And essentially, they assess the risk involved in lending money to a country, to a government, or even to an organization. They do so by assessing the willingness and the ability of the borrower to repay the amount and to repay interest. To do that, here comes the crux. To do that, they look at a range of both measurable quantitative variables, such as economic growth, size of the economy, liquidity, etc., but also a number of variables or measurements which are not measurable, which have to do with political stability or lack thereof, social stability, policy expectations. And herein lies the real problem. Very often those ratings are based on sometimes subjective, normative, one-on-one discussions. And in the case of Africa, we tend to find that I think all of the analysts working for the three I've just mentioned are not based on Africa. They often do desktop research. So there's a very strong chance that some of the ratings might be biased through lack of on-the-ground knowledge of what's going on in a country, and also as a result of a misinterpretation of the African context. Context is important. Each country has its own idiosyncrasies.
But then when we look at the proposed African-based credit ratings agency that the AU is pushing, and the fact that it will be based on the continent and is said to add indigenous context to the information investors need for decision making, don't you think that that narrative would aptly capture the African talks and, of course, the indices in terms of the possibility of information that is to be given that represents the true nature of the African economics and dynamics? Don't you think that will happen?
That is indeed the idea, and that's the hope. I do not think that an African-based rating agency will replace any other one. I think it will add a very important nuance. It will add more richness and more context to, let's say, the big three reports. So it won't replace that. We still need the big three. I mean, those are the most credible ones that the world out there has known for so many years. They'll never abandon them. Having said that, even beyond Africa, the big three have sometimes made some major errors. They got the 1997 Southeast Asian crisis wrong. They got the 2008-2009 financial crisis wrong. More recently, what is it, Yellowstone? They didn't even identify that happening. They're not perfect at all. So I think it's never a question of either or, but the two complementing each other, or the official ones or the big ones complementing an African-based one, if only by using people, analysts, who are in and of Africa and not sitting in some distant office elsewhere in the world behind a computer and doing desktop research. That alone will make a difference. It's also been shown, interestingly, that over and above the big three, which dominate, there are many other smaller regional or country-specific rating agencies. And the big three seem to take note of the smaller ones, knowing that they are closer to reality, knowing they're on the ground, as it were. So I think, to repeat myself, I don't think we'll see the African-based one replacing any other ones, but providing a rich context a better nuance of the realities which are perhaps unique to African countries.
All right. There are arguments saying that these rating agencies and the reports they give out are actually skewed in favoritism of the West on the continent as against Africa. So let's do a bit of a better contextualization of this particular discourse. For instance, Ukraine, despite the fact that it has not been able to meaningfully gain revenue, of course, because of the onslaught that has been faced based on the Russian invasion on the country, it actually got CA and CCC plus ratings from Moody's and S&P agencies, with, of course, a stable outcome from February and April. But then people are asking the question, why does Fitch, Standard & Poor's and Moody's give unequal valuation while pulling data from same source?
Yeah, well, that's exactly the point I was making a bit earlier. They use a whole range of metrics, some of which are measurable, but others are simply not measurable. They're based on surveys, opinions garnered through desktop, through social media. And so therein lies, I think, the real crunch in all of this, which again justifies having a more localized agency, which is closer to reality, which is able to provide the right interpretation. There are some other, if you like, obstacles in all of these things. So, for instance, we find that for Africa, the ratings agencies often release a new rating without announcing it. There's no calendar. For many countries outside Africa, there's a very strict calendar where countries know when the latest rating will be released. We also suspect that the big three follow a kind of a herd behavior. They more or less say the same thing. Someone goes first, and the next two won't really differ significantly. And then a very practical point, the big three, they are absolutely overburdened. The last number I saw was between them, they are dealing with around about 2 million different credit ratings. We are told that, for instance, in Africa, at one of the credit rating agencies, there's one analyst responsible for finding information and making a decision for more than 10 countries. I mean, that's ridiculous. So they are not without their own built-in, if you like, faults and shortcomings. And I agree with what you said a bit earlier. I think we see it now on the screen, that very often they're very quick to downgrade African countries, much slower to upgrade them. So again, your example of Ukraine and the apparent anomaly, I think is a very good example, illustrating exactly this point, that despite the real situation in Africa often being better than is suggested in official figures, we tend to often get downgradings.
So when we have discussions like this, it kind of puts a bit of a question mark on the credibility of these reports being given out by these credit ratings agency. Let's take a look at Zambia, for instance. It is one of the countries in Africa to have been battered by these rating agencies. Moody's downgraded Zambia's ratings to about CAA2. While outlook changed to negative in April 2019. So what factors, if you are going to do give your own assessment or your opinion, what factors would you say led to that rating? And would you say that that was enough for the downgrade being handed down to Zambia?
Yeah, I must admit I haven't taken a specific look at Zambia, but typically it kind of resonates with what we're saying in terms of the standard benchmarks, things such as government debt as a share of the economy rising rapidly, in terms of the then growth outlooks for Zambia. I presume the ratings agency used that as a justification. But let me add something else here, and that is that one cannot just look at things such as total debt as a share of GDP. For some countries, it might be fairly low and yet risky. Others might be much higher, such as Japan, and less risky. You also need to dig deeper and have a look at the reasons for incurring so much more additional debt, which might very often be borrowing money to finance current spending. That's not very smart. That would count against the country. It has been calculated, by the way, just to support what you're saying, that in the last couple of years, because of perhaps inappropriately low or punitive ratings for Africa, which is accompanied by having to pay higher rates of interest, we have lost up to $75 billion $75 billion has been kind of eroded as a result. Because remember, these ratings also become a self-fulfilling prophecy. If a country or a government is downgraded, for instance, because of concerns of fiscal sustainability, well, then the very nature of the downgrade means that government will find it more difficult to borrow more money and/or will have to pay a premium on interest. And that could actually bring about that fiscal unsustainability that was identified initially by the rating agency. So that's another problem. It could become a self-fulfilling prophecy. A downgrade could result in a further deterioration in a country's economics or fiscal situation.
Okay, according to reports, it was said that Ghana actually did not also fare better looking at the ratings. This actually led the Deputy Minister of Finance calling Moody's rating action a propaganda. And the minister also insisted that the rating action was as a result of a grand conspiracy to force the country into an IMF program. That's actually a weighty allegation. So I'd like to find out from you, are these accusations legal or baseless?
I'm always very careful about these kind of accusations, along with even conspiracy theories. So difficult to prove. If they were correct, if we knew they were correct, then we'd be probably part of the conspiracy. I think, in all honesty, there are never any sinister motivations behind any downgrading. I think, however, that, as I've said a bit earlier, they're not always based on the correct interpretation of affairs. I don't think an agency will deliberately try to, as I say, punish in a sinister fashion a country, but just based on their criteria, they reach a certain conclusion, or actually provide an opinion, which brings us back to where we started. I think that is why a more locally based agency is indeed justified to kind of filter out I'm going to use the word ignorance. Ignorance, which is not the same as being stupid, not the same as being nasty, just ignorance, because as I said earlier, very often a big part of the research and the ultimate rating is based on desktop research. Some of these analysts have never been to Africa in their lives. I always ask myself, imagine if I were to be involved in trying to give some kind of credit rating of Germany from here in Cape Town. I've never been to Germany. It would be extremely presumptuous of me to just based on a set of figures and surveys to make such a decision. I think you need to be on the ground as well. And that, as I say, justifies, warrants, I believe, the establishment of a more local agency. Which,
Professor,
by the way,
Professor, you said that you do not feel that there is any sinister move or clandestine move in terms of these downgradings or these ratings being accorded to these African countries. But then we have seen a couple of these African countries who have restructured most, if not all of their debts. But then we've not seen these credit raters come out, or these rating firms come out to review the ratings. At this point, we probably should have seen periodic publications of reports showing or stipulating that for African countries that have ensured debt restructuring in their countries, these are what they have done, and these are the outcomes, or the likely outcomes are probably in the nearest future. But we have not seen that. So what do you make of the coyness of these rating agencies, even as we see some changes in the dynamics of these African countries in terms of their debt restructuring process?
Yeah, well, as I'm saying, they don't only look at debt restructuring. That's obviously a very key thing. They look at sometimes more than 100 different variables. Each has a certain weighting, and many of them relate to policies in a country or perceived policies, future policies, policy uncertainty, the political climate as they read it, the social climate as they read it, international relations, a whole bunch of things. They won't change a rating just on the basis of one single thing, such as better debt restructuring. Also bear in mind, it takes, I think with the last figure I saw recently, on average, when a country has been downgraded to so-called junk bond rating, it can take 7, 8, 9, 10 years before it is regraded into a slightly better investment grade. But that's also part of what the criticism is against the Standard & Poor's and the like. And that is they're very quick to downgrade African countries they're much more hesitant. It takes much longer time. It's much slower to find an upgrade. So once again, I cannot prove or disprove any accusations of clandestine, sinister, deliberate downgradings. I think they are doing the best they can, given the information at their disposal. But as I can't prove that is necessarily dishonest, deliberately dishonest, or deliberately clandestine, or deliberately sinister.
That's quite understandable, Professor. Some economists and, of course, some financial experts have said that whatever the case may be, they will still believe ratings being handed down by the Moody's, S&P's global ratings, and Fitch and the likes as against other kind of ratings that may come from other agencies, which also means that they're throwing their weight of course, at these particular foreign agencies. But then you earlier talked about the need for harmonization of facts and data and details before reports are being made. So if this AU-backed ratings agency is to be created and ratified, what advice would you give in terms of the project? And which nation would you say it should be located? Because, of course, it will be covering the whole of Africa, and we would need factual data coming out from every end in Africa to give a true representation of what it operates, of what operates or obtains in Africa.
Well, I would say that this, let's call it, what should we call it? African Ratings Agency, whatever name is going to go by. In an ideal world, this is hopefully, I think, what we're aiming for, is that the likes of Moody's will take that report, the African Rating Agency report, into consideration. They will build it in to their assessment of especially the non-measurable stuff. As I said a bit earlier, we find that many of the smaller or more localized or even country-based credit rating agencies, we find that Moody's and the like do take them into account before releasing their particular rating. So as long as the local one has credibility, as long as it is conducted, the research is conducted, and I'm sure it will be, in a credible, rigorous way, as long as it doesn't overstate its case. I mean, we don't want to see a situation where the new credit rating agencies or agency goes crazy and suddenly says, well, country X in Africa actually deserves a AAA rating. I mean, then it will lose credibility. But I think as long as their ratings feed into those of the likes of, and you're quite right, Standard & Poor's and the like, they remain the golden medal, as it were. They remain the yardstick at which most lenders will look at before extending credit to a government or other. Bear in mind that the very first country to be assessed at all happened to be South Africa as recently as 1994. Before then, no country in Africa was even assessed. Now many are, not all, and hopefully this new ratings agency will also draw in those 10, 20 countries which don't even have a credit rating. The ultimate first prize for African countries would be a more nuanced assessment of our debt burdens, and obviously from that, hopefully, a more favorable rate of interest at which we borrow that money. Because as it is right now in the majority of African countries, debt payments on debt is either the biggest budget item and or the fastest growing budget item. And again, that threatens sustainability. A more favorable credit rating should, to some extent, alleviate that very high burden.
And talking about a favorable credit rating, we know that investors, international organizations, and of course other stakeholders bear on this kind of information and these reports, and that is how it informs their decision or how they choose to relate with Africa. So it is actually important to have factual information and reporting coming out of these credit rating agencies. Now, Professor Andrew Roux, an economist from Cape Town in South Africa, thank you so much for talking to us.
Thank you.